Hello and welcome back to Renovate Online. As I've said previously, Renovate was created with one goal in mind, to provide a picture of the new life that's possible for each of us. We all get stuck sometimes, and getting unstuck requires a plan, a personal renovation. In our previous sessions, we began our renovation. We talked about false beliefs that we all have from our influences and experiences. At our last session, we talked about one important part of the personal renovation, and that's our identity. As we craft our plan, a major part of securing our foundation is choosing to see ourselves as God sees us. And as we move forward, we all have to remind ourselves of the truth of how He sees us when we're tempted to drift back towards a false belief. If you've ever done major renovation work on your home, then you've experienced one thing that inevitably happens. Renovations result in a lot of trash. Often in a renovation, we have to bring in a large dumpster to contain all of that trash that surfaces through the process. And the reason is obvious. You have to tear out the old to make space for the new. It would be crazy in a renovation to keep both the old and the new. The same is true for our personal renovations. But in our renovation, we're not removing physical trash, but all that emotional baggage that's weighing us down from the old ways of thinking or our past hurts. These are the moments that we can be tempted to give up on a personal renovation. It can be easy to say, this is just too much work. Why bother? I encourage you to stick with it. There is a picture waiting at the end of this renovation process that is worth it. I can attest to that in my own life. I did not want to be a bitter person. I wanted to be free from those feelings that were weighing me down. Going through this process felt like a ton of bricks just lifted off of my shoulders. The freedom I've experienced has been so worth it. And we really want you to experience the fullness of life that is possible. In this session, we're going to talk about a crucial topic for any personal spiritual renovation, and that is forgiveness. Now, listen in as my good friend Elaine Scott shares from her own story about the work and power of forgiveness.
One of the most important things I've learned in life is how critical our choices are. Because you can't always control what happens to you in life, but you can choose how you're going to respond to what happens. And in my story, when it came to forgiveness, that made all the difference in the world. Now, I know some of you, just hearing me say the word forgiveness, you're already thinking, and you've got your guard up for me, and you're going, I already know where Elaine's going to go with this. She's going to tell me that I have to forgive. I get that. Listen, but if you'll just listen to my story, maybe you'll understand why I'm talking with you about forgiveness. Because I know it's not as simple as it may seem. When I was 15, I was in a desperate and lonely place. I made a life-changing decision to become a Christian, but I didn't tell anyone, and so I grew very little. In fact, it wasn't until I was 18 years old that I began attending church, thanks to a friend who was a relentless inviter. And I attended a class that was for people just like me who didn't know a whole lot about the Bible and really didn't know much about the whole Jesus thing. But the more I learned, the more I began to understand that Jesus wanted to be with me in what I was going through, and that He offered a lot of things. The problem was the amazing things He offered, things like joy and peace and freedom from guilt and shame, well, they involved a lot of choices that, quite honestly, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make. They were hard choices. In fact, that's when God began to teach me about forgiveness. It wasn't long after that I came across this verse in my early 20s. This is what He says. It's in the book of Matthew, and Jesus is talking to His followers. And here's what He says. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, this verse made me mad. I didn't want this to be in the Bible at all. I felt like this was impossible for anybody to do. Now, I love Jesus. I really did. But honestly, I was angry. And the reason why goes all the way back to when I was 12 years old. That age marked the beginning of a long season of abuse from a family member. I was nearly crushed under the weight of shame and guilt, and I didn't dare tell anybody what was going on because I was so afraid. But remember, I was 12, I was young, and so I had to develop some coping strategies really quick to survive and protect myself. As a result, I came up with 2 things. The first thing was men could not be trusted. They were unsafe and to be avoided. The second thing was I was just gonna have to bury my pain. So that's what I did. I took my anger, my guilt, and my shame, and I stuffed it way down inside of me. I learned how to smile and say that everything was fine. Wonderful, in fact. So I had an enemy. And the last thing I wanted was for Jesus to tell me to love and pray for him. I mean, if anybody deserved a pass in this, it was me. I loved Jesus. But he had asked me to do the impossible. He had crossed a line. He had gone too far. But Jesus is relentless. And it was not long after this that I began to learn about forgiveness through reading the Bible and messages at church and talking to people that I trusted. And as a result of this, I found myself facing the challenge to forgive my abuser. But remember, the abuse hadn't been so very long ago, and I really felt like it was unfair of God to expect me to forgive. Fair to me looked like God demonstrating a little bit of his wrath on my abuser. That would have been fair. And I searched the Bible. I was looking as hard as I could. I hunted down any example I could find of a wrathful Jesus, a vengeful Jesus. But I couldn't find him. The only Jesus I could find was a forgiving Jesus. So as a result, I made 2 decisions. The first decision I made was to stop making every guy pay for what only one guy did to me. The second thing, I decided that if Jesus could forgive, then he could teach me to forgive. And so I forgave. Now, just a few years later, I am engaged to be married. I am in love, and we are in premarital counseling, and we're sitting across from our mentors, and they're telling us how to live happily ever after. And they pull me aside and they warn me and say, Elaine, you need to understand that marriage involves a whole new level of intimacy. So we just want to let you know not to be surprised if after you're married, some of these things from your past come up and you're going to need to work through them. And I said, oh, well, thanks for the caution, but here's the thing. I had already done that. I had already forgiven. I had already forgiven. So I didn't think it was going to be an issue. And besides, we were in love. So we got married. And it wasn't long after that that I realized that they were right. I had issues. And it made me angry all over again because once more, I'm dealing with pain and struggles from something that wasn't even my fault. And I'm dealing with the backlash of that at a time in my life where I should have been my happiest and the most carefree. My abuser was sleeping fine at night. I was not. It was just one more way that he had robbed me. And I remember thinking to myself, I am not going to forgive him again because he does not deserve my forgiveness. But here's what I knew. I knew that if I didn't forgive, that I would be a barrier in my marriage and in my family becoming everything that it could be. I knew that I would be limited in my ability to relate in a healthy way to those that I loved the most. And as much as I wanted to blame him for all of that, I knew that in this case, it was my fault. So I made 2 decisions. I decided that I was going to take responsibility for my own life, and I was going to refuse to use abuse as an excuse to not forgive and heal. The other thing I decided was this, that if Jesus could teach me to forgive a little, then he could teach me to forgive a lot. And so I made the decision to forgive. And the healing process was much harder than the first time. Now, jumping ahead, life is going great. I'm in my mid-30s. We've been married a long time. The kids are great. Life is wonderful. And then I hear a message by my pastor. And as a result, I found myself confronted with the challenge to let my abuser know that I had forgiven him and to share what God had done in my life. Now, I know that's not typical for everyone, and God may not ask you to do that, but that's what God asked me to do. So I thought about it. And I decided that I could write a letter. Because in all honesty, to go to him in person, I just couldn't do it. So I wrote a letter. And right before I mailed it, I felt fear all over again because I knew that once I mailed it, I had no control over the outcome. I didn't know what he would say. I didn't know what he would do. And I was really afraid. But here's what God reminded me. God loves those who are far from him. And Jesus died so that everyone could experience his grace and forgiveness. And everyone included my abuser. So I mailed a letter, and I decided to leave the outcome to God. And do you know what happened? Nothing. Absolute silence on his end. But what God did in this season was allow me to see my abuser as more than his bad choices and the pain he caused. It allowed me to let him be human again, someone that God loved and cared about and not a monster. It was a really important step for me in the healing process. God had brought me full circle back to that impossible verse in Matthew. Forgiveness had paved the way for me to love and pray for my enemy. And I don't know where you are in the process of forgiveness. I mean, you may be on the front end of this thing and it's enough for you to just kind of take it all in. You may be somewhere in between and you're just feeling this weird mix of emotions and thoughts and that's okay. Or you may be on the other side of forgiveness and you want to stand up and shout right now because you know how great forgiveness is. But no matter where you may fall in that, my encouragement to you would be to just stay with it. Because the truth is, a lack of forgiveness can be one of the biggest hindrances to living fully free in Christ. So let's talk about forgiveness for just a minute. And if it's okay, I'd love to start with talking about some of the myths around forgiveness because they're out there. And the problem with myths is that it prevents people from experiencing the freedom that comes with forgiveness. So the first one is, some people believe that forgiveness is excusing the other person's behavior. And I get that because in my story, one of the fears I had was that if I did forgive my abuser, it was sort of saying that what he had done was okay. And that's just not true. The reason we forgive is because the offense that was done is not excusable. So forgiveness is not the same thing as excusing someone else's behavior. Forgiveness is also not forgetting. I mean, it would be silly to expect that we would literally forget. You have just heard me share my whole story. I haven't forgotten any of it. So forgive and forget just doesn't work. We forgive precisely because we can't forget. Forgiveness enables us to remember that we have chosen not to allow the offense to be a barrier between us and the other person. So forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is also, it's not a feeling. I mean, yes, sometimes you're going to have feelings that seem to be consistent with how we associate forgiveness. You may feel peace. You may feel a sense of love and goodwill to the other person. But the reality is, in fact, many times in my story, my emotions were in direct contrast with what my mind had decided to do. My mind said, hey, we're going to forgive my abuser. But my emotion said, don't do that. We still feel angry. We're still hurt. We still have pain. We want vengeance. So forgiveness is not a feeling. The last thing is that forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. Reconciliation requires that the offender be truly repentant about the offense. Reconciliation also involves the rebuilding of trust, and that requires both parties willing to work towards that goal. Now, forgiveness happens within the heart of an individual, and it does not require reconciliation. So, forgiveness is not reconciliation. Now, if these are all the things that forgiveness is not, then it begs the question, what is forgiveness? Well, here's a definition. Forgiveness is a choice I make through faith in God to give up the right to hold the other person accountable for the wrong done to me. Let me say it one more time. Forgiveness is a choice I make through faith in God to give up the right to hold the other person accountable for the wrong done to me. And hopefully you heard that in my story, because it all boiled down to each choice God placed before me to either forgive or not forgive. You know, the reality is we've been forgiven on a level that we'll never fully comprehend. There is no way for us to count the number of sins we have committed against God. But because of Christ, we have been fully forgiven. And because of Christ, we are free to forgive. I would love to end with a verse that I believe sums up what we've been talking about really well. It's found in Ephesians, and it says this: "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." There is great freedom in forgiveness. It's one of the best choices that we can make. It's one of the best choices I've ever made.
You may hear Elaine's story and immediately relate to something that's occurred in your own life. Or perhaps you haven't experienced something that requires as much hard work of forgiveness. But I know there's one thing we all have in common. We've all had the experience of someone asking us, "How are you?" And we responded with, "I'm fine," but we knew inside that wasn't the case. Now, I'm not talking about a bad day, I'm talking about a burden. Elaine's struggle to forgive was a burden for her. It was a barrier to her experience the fullness of life that Jesus provided. Holding on to unforgiveness was a major burden for me. Choosing to forgive was a big part of my personal renovation journey. Here's one key thing to remember. Fullness of life doesn't mean that we pretend that wrongs were never done to us. It means that because of Jesus, wrongs done to us don't have the power to undo us. Now, you may be like me, and it may take some time to work through unforgiveness. And it's possible you may benefit from time with a professional counselor to work through what happened to you. Many of us have benefited from having a professional counselor help us begin the process of forgiveness. Maybe you, like Elaine and I, need to start to deal with a burden of unforgiveness that you've been carrying. Or maybe there is another burden that you've been carrying that's preventing you from experiencing freedom. Listen to these words that Jesus spoke to his followers during his ministry on earth. Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." Jesus invites us to come to him with our heavy burdens. And I can tell you from personal experience that trying to carry our own burdens is exhausting. I'm sure you felt that too. So why would we try when Jesus makes another way, a better way possible? And he doesn't just say that he'll take the burden. He says something else too. He says, "I will give you rest." Doesn't that sound wonderful? Rest from our worries, rest from carrying the pain of our past hurts, or rest from the heavy weight of unforgiveness that's taken residency in our lives. Jesus encourages us to let him teach us. He says we will find rest for our souls. In a home renovation, taking out the trash results in a clean work site. In a personal renovation, taking out the trash of burdens we've been carrying results in a soul at rest. Forgiving my ex-husband is something I have to keep current. When I find myself starting to wrestle and something hurtful new pops up, I have to forgive again. I made that decision years ago. I will forgive for past hurts and any new hurts that come up because I don't want to carry the burden of unforgiveness. I trust God. I trust that he will bring all the truth to light. I trust that his will be done in his perfect timing. So how about you? Where could you use rest for your soul? An area may have immediately come to mind, or perhaps you need some time to reflect. We're going to give you that time to consider the answer to that question. We've created a resource to guide you through the process. It's a list of common struggles we all may experience that prevent us from depending on Jesus and experiencing the life he makes possible. The reflection work you do on your own after these sessions is so key in helping you craft a plan for your personal renovation. So make sure you carve out time to consider what things you may need to let go of in your own life. And let me say one last thing before I end. You are doing a good work. The fact that you are working through these sessions and doing the work on your own is evidence of the fact that you want to grow. I assure you this personal renovation will be worth it, and I look forward to seeing you back next time for session 4.